Hello and welcome to the ASCA webinar series on the ASCA RAMP components. We are on section 11, which is the Closing the Gap Results Report. As you can see, it is worth 6 points, which is the highest possible points for any component. So this one really matters. My name's Karen Griffith.
And I'm Mark Krantz.
A disclaimer that we start with is that you need to always check the website to ensure that you're using the most current rubric. It does get tweaked. They're usually small tweaks, and it's always with the intent to make things more clear and more specific. So make sure you're using the most current one. Even so, when those tweaks apply, it won't change what we're telling you here. You can use the same procedures that we talk about in this, even with a new rubric. The rubric is what readers use to evaluate your application. So it only makes sense that you also use it to write your application.
So when you look at the Closing the Gap Results Report, if you want more information, the ASCA National Model Implementation Guide on pages 144 to 155 give you lots of examples of great Closing the Gap Results Report. The Closing the Gap is really about looking at gaps, discrepancies that exist around those data points of academics, achievement, and behavior targeted at specific groups. Why are some kids experiencing so many behavior referrals? I think the smart thing to do here is, because Closing the Gap results reports are tied to a very specific program goal, you make this one of your school counseling program goals that you share in component number 3, and you can just cut and paste that program goal into the Closing the Gap Results Report to start this process. Recognize that in section 11 you're only sharing the Closing the Gap Results Report, not the plan, and that's a little different from the other results reports that you share for small groups and core curriculum. I think it's also important to note here that you've done this work. This results report isn't going to ask you for any kind of information that you haven't already examined or thought about in the past. For example, it's really going to focus on you understanding the 3 types of data: process, perception, and outcome.
So Closing the Gap Results Report focuses on a gap that was identified through school data. This is essential. You've got to look for those discrepancies in attendance, academics, or behavior. You might look for an overrepresentation of a specific group. Perhaps one subgroup of students is getting higher referrals for behavior, experiencing one particular kind of consequence for behavior. Having too many absences or something else. Or perhaps there's an underrepresentation of a specific group. Perhaps one group of students is not getting access to the highest rigor of coursework available, and you need to look at that gap and identify what the issues are and how you might be able to intervene. Once you've identified the gap and identified the most important one, you're going to write a meaningful goal, making sure that you include all of those components of a SMART goal. And then you're going to look at your objectives, your target group, and the interventions and activities that you are designing for them. Those 3 have to be linked together specifically. Different groups of students need different things. Different objectives require different interventions. They are all highly aligned, and they are developmentally appropriate.
So when you're looking at Closing the Gap results reports, just like the other results report, it's really important that you understand the difference between process, perception, and outcome data. So we want to take a moment just to quickly review that. Process data is just the facts. How many, how often, when do you start, when do you end? Very simple data to collect. Perception data is the data that you collect around what kids learn, what students learn from you in terms of attitudes. What do they believe now that they didn't believe before? Knowledge. What do they know about a process? What are the steps that they now know are critical to resolving conflict? And skills. What skills have they now put into their toolbox and can use to resolve anger issues. You want to be able to capture that growth because of the intervention and activities that you do with those students. The best way to capture that growth is through a pre-post survey. So you administer the pre before you start any of the interventions. You do all the interventions, and when the time is ended, you administer the results, and then you can compare and contrast what's happened. Those items in those pre-post surveys are driven by the mindsets and behaviors, because we know the 6 mindsets and the 29 behaviors are what research now say effective learners have incorporated into who they are. They're good success skills that successful students employ. So it really is important that those mindsets and behaviors drive those perception data that you want to make sure kids know. The other piece around perception data is you have to share a chart that summarizes the perception data. I think it's always helpful to have a third or fourth pair of eyes look at your chart, and if they can explain what it means, you now know that you have developed a good chart. The last piece here in the types of data is outcome data, and that's tracking the changes in either academics, attendance, or behavior. So the goal is clearly targeted in terms of changing some piece of academics, attendance, or behavior.
Next is the implication sections, and with the as with the other results report, this section is critical. This is where you are looking at the data you collected, analyzing the data, and then making decisions about how to do what you do better. You're going to identify what worked, you're going to identify what didn't work, and you're going to use that information to make decisions about how to deliver this intervention in a more efficient, effective way. Perhaps it needs to occur at a different time of day of the week, or time of the school year. Perhaps the content wasn't well matched to the mindsets and perceptions or to the need itself, and there needs to be adjustment. Perhaps your assessments didn't collect the information that you really needed to know. All of that is used in the implication sections to target how to do it better next time.
So in the narrative, like the other narratives and all the other components, you need to make sure you address what's being asked of you in the narrative. So we just cut and paste the narrative on the top part of the slide from the rubric. We think the best way to make sure you really address this section is take that narrative and break it down into the bullet points. So we see that in this narrative there's 3 things you need to address. We suggest that you write a paragraph addressing each one of them. So there'll be one paragraph that strictly talks about how the gap was identified, what data you looked at, what kind of conversations you had with stakeholders to see if this was really a critical piece that is aligned with the school improvement goals. So that paragraph only talks about how the gap was identified, and then you have a second and third paragraph addressing the other 2 bullet points. This helps you make sure you really addressed the issues that are asked of you in the narrative, and it really helps the reader clearly identify and evaluate this part of the component. One thing I want to say about results reports in terms of closing the gap is how are they different from small group and core curriculum. You know, closing the gap allows you to use any kind of activities or interventions. You may decide to do a small group a couple times. There may be some information that these kids who are getting this closing the gap work are sitting in a 3rd grade classroom and getting a core curriculum, and it's addressing some of the same issues. So it might be core curriculum. It might be some consultation that you do with families or teachers, parents, guardians. But it's all those activities that come together and are directed at changing that data point, which is different from small groups, because small groups is just, the intervention is just a small group, and core curriculum is just for all. So there is a difference.
So think about your Closing the Gap results report and ask yourself these three questions. Is your gap grounded in data? It has to be linked to that data, and the data is around attendance, achievement, and behavior. Is your perception assessment guided by the mindsets and behaviors? There are websites and there are webinars available on the website that give very explicit directions on how to develop meaningful perception assessments that are driven by the mindsets and behaviors selected for the intervention. And does your narrative focus on the how, the why, and the what comes next?
So in each section, each component of RAMP, there's a do's and don'ts, which comes from the National Model Implementation Guide. I think this is a representative sample from the do's and don'ts. If you go to the guide, you'll see a lot more. You'll see many of the points we've already talked about. You know, Karen just said you need to identify the need through school data. If your interventions are reflective of some research, you need to cite that and tell us that the part of the strategies and interventions that you're using have been validated through research. I think it's really important to understand that one of the don'ts is don't rely on standard school responses or protocols that just happen. For example, many times around attendance issues, one of the strategies is to generate letters going home to families saying, your son or daughter has been missing too much school. That might be an effective strategy, it might be necessary, it might be phone calls, but that isn't unique to you as a school counselor, and that isn't what the results report is hoping to get from you. We're looking for activities that are unique to school counselors and to the school counseling program. And not to say that those letters home or those phone calls home aren't important and effective, but they aren't school counseling driven. And so that's important to think about. So this is a good place to do some self-checking on where are you in terms of aligning and implementing the Closing the Gap work.
So the pitfalls around the Closing the Gap include a limited data story. This is a place where you want to give your best possible data assessments and tell the best possible story. Again, it's confusing between the perception and the outcome, and it's those implication comments that without meaningful insight, that don't inform the future. These are the big pieces we've said over and over again that you want to check and make sure represent exemplary responses to the Closing the Gap. So thank you for joining us for this webinar. We appreciate your attendance.
And we wish you the best of luck in this process.